microphone warmer, please. I'm going to pass out some books about. This one's my favorite, and it's not on restorative justice, but I'm going to kind of end it. It's called The Maid Narrative. So let's see. I'll pass up there. I put some flyers out. No, I don't think I'll need the microphone, right?
Sure.
Especially
Can y'all hear?
if she would move up. And
Oh,
are
she's
you all
filming it.
taping it? It's not for, I make it more dramatic if it's for TV, but I assume it's not.
No.
Okay. Well, restorative justice is absolutely marvelous. I got so excited when I went to Canada in the early 1990s. I was doing a presentation, and as often happens, people in the audience know more than I do. So here I was, and they started telling me, Canadian social workers, about how the juvenile justice system was working there in Canada with restorative justice, how offender and victim were being brought together. Oh, please come up. Can you all come up so I don't have to talk so loud? Thank you. Yeah. See, I had asked for a small room. This is what they gave me. Yeah. I said, I don't want this room. I was in this room last night. And Joyous said, you won't have this room. Yeah. So I wanted to go back because the Canadian social workers knew all about restorative justice, but the U.S. social workers didn't know anything about it. And that became my mission. So it's not something that I was going to the prison system actually doing, bringing the victim families in with people who had committed murder. But what I did was I did all the research I could, and I just churned out the articles. For this book that's going around, I was really lucky because this woman, I'm boring compared to, you think I was an exciting person. I just sit there and write. But I did get in the middle of all these, I guess, like civil rights movement in America, because I happened to be at UNC at the time in 1963. So it was like I would go out and I would end up doing sit-ins and all this kind of thing. But mostly my life has been pretty dull, mostly. And then I got to Northern Ireland, and I was there in their civil rights movement. I just happened to be there when the Catholics were very much being discriminated against, and so I got into that. But restorative justice is something that I really wanted to do something with, and the co-author is someone who goes around to the prison systems, and she's been on the Oprah show. I had read about her. I wrote her a letter, and email is marvelous for introverts because you don't have to have the nerve to call somebody up. I emailed her, how would you like to be a co-author of a book? She said, oh, I'd love to. And so that's how I got Lauren Walker to be my co-author, and then she wrote all these chapters about what she's doing in Hawaii. And I was told that the social work department is interested in financial exploitation of elders, is that right?
That's correct.
So I tied that in, found some marvelous research on that. Re-entry programs in the prison system, and that's what Lauren Walker has been doing in Hawaii. And so I know about that. She's written a chapter in the book on that. There was one other topic. I'm sure I have it in there too. Anyway, whatever it is. There were three of them that you all, anybody know what's the third one that you all are interested in? It's the re-entry, the financial exploitation of elders.
I think we were also interested in the maid narratives.
Oh, okay, yeah. Or reparations. See, that's where it ties in. I'm going to argue for reparations. That's controversial. I found out when I wrote a blog for Psychology Today, arguing in favor of reparations for the Jim Crow women, not for the slave descendants, but the descendants of people who come from where I'm from the South, who lived under and endured what I know because of the narratives that they wrote or they mostly told us. Those stories makes you think they deserve something after what they went through. So I argued for that, but the letters that came to me were the opposite of fan mail. I mean, it was hate mail, actually, that I got. And they said, well, I'm Italian, and we deserve pay, too. You know, what are you talking about? I'm Irish American, and we were mistreated when we first came. Don't we deserve? You know, they were sarcastic, all these sarcastic letters, and I thought, well, I didn't know it was even that controversial. But it's because reparations is a part of restorative justice, the restitution for the wrongs that have been done. And that is on the national level. It could be on the community level, or it's often on the individual level, when you bring individual and offender together. Sometimes forgiveness even comes into play. Okay, let's see what I have here. I thought I would start out just defining restorative justice, and then I want to tell you a story. I was hoping Dr. Johnson said he was dying to hear my talk, and the best story would be at the beginning. I guess he hasn't come yet. That's his name, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah,
And
I met
he'll be
him
there
last
tomorrow
night.
at the field things, too.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe it'll be tomorrow. That's where I'll get to meet him, and I'll tell him about the Maid narrative. And the theme of the conference is justice for all. That's the beauty of restorative justice, because it's for the victim. It's very oriented toward the victim, survivor of crime or wrongdoing. It can be in the school system. It can be the victim, a child who's been victimized by bullying, and the teachers will come together. Maybe a social worker will be there as facilitator. And it starts out with the person who was victimized telling the suffering. Oh, please move up so I don't have to talk so loud. Thank you. And then they have a support system for the person who's the victim. And then they have the support system for the person who's the wrongdoer. In this case, it might be the bully in the school system. Like his mother might be there with him, but often she's been abusing him. You know, often it goes back to abuse in his or her family. So there'll be a support system saying, you know, the bully really isn't, you know, that bad, and bringing out some redeeming characteristics. And then there'll be community members too, and they'll sit in a circle. Sometimes they'll use a ceremony, and this is borrowed from Native Americans, or in the case of Canada, First Nations people. And they will use a feather, and they pass around the feather for the person to talk. Now, they could have used that the other night, if anybody saw the debate, with Tim Kaine and Pence. What's his first name? What, Pence? Anyway, Pence and Kaine, they're together, interrupting each other, shouting over each other. If they had had a feather, they would have been passing it back and forth. You know, it's your turn to speak. So one person is listening and one person is speaking. And so that is the formality of the part, but basically it's informal compared to the courtroom of justice. I've got the definition here, just JUS, meaning right, and usually legal right. And restorative justice sometimes works through the criminal justice system, and sometimes it's instead of the traditional criminal justice system. It's a whole way of thinking. It's a new way of thinking, but it's also an old way of thinking. And later we'll go over all the paradoxes. I worked out a list of, it's paradoxical, the aspects of restorative justice. It's called a revolution. It's called a new paradigm, a different paradigm for justice than the one that is traditional. You can see here the examples I have: school system, prison system. So here's somebody in prison. Sometimes the offender says, I would really like to meet with family members. I'm about to be released, and I have done something really awful. Often the case would be drunken driving, and they've killed someone and they're charged with manslaughter or murder in the second degree, and they serve time in prison. They're coming back into the community, and maybe the offender wants to meet with the victim, but usually it comes with the victim saying, I want to meet with that person. I want to tell him or her the suffering this little boy who lost his father because of the car crash. I want to present that to this person in prison. And they meet, and they have this meeting. But before that, they might spend a whole year in counseling. So here's a lot of work for counselors who work in the prison system, and a lot of work for social workers to prepare the person for the meeting. So they're not going there to get revenge. They're not going there to make excuses for the crime that was committed. And to have this face-to-face interaction. It often ends with, yeah, question.
Comment. In Pennsylvania, there's actually a program for the Office of the Victim Advocate called the Victim Offender Dialogue Program.
Uh-huh.
I facilitated a case last summer between somebody who went in as a juvenile but is serving 2 life sentences,
Uh-huh.
which is a whole other issue.
Yes.
But so there, and we're not trained we're trained to prepare them. We're not doing any kind of therapy in that preparation.
Uh-huh.
But there is a preparation process.
But it really is a form of therapy, isn't
Yeah,
it? I mean, it's therapeutic. Look at it that way.
It's all therapeutic.
Yeah, and they're working on their feelings and their motives, so
Yes.
that their motives are,
Yeah.
and what to expect.
Right, and so
Yeah.
the facilitator role is to kind of keep a safe space for everybody who's involved.
Yes, yes.
And locally, there's a restorative justice agency here in Lancaster, the Center for Community Peacemaking, and we do this kind of dialogue with juvenile offenders.
Yeah, and if I can get off the track, and that's okay because I've already covered this slide. I was really surprised. Millersville, I didn't know much about it. Now I find I'm in the heart of Mennonite country, and the Mennonites are the ones who are involved here. So this is something that's much more active here in Pennsylvania than Iowa, so we really should have you come to Iowa and teach us. Iowa, we only have one person, and this one person is in Des Moines, and somebody who says, I want to meet, with the wrongdoer or the offender, they have to call that person all the way to travel across the state. Whereas Minnesota, now, they're extremely active, and Vermont, of course, the whole juvenile justice system. Pennsylvania also has the Quaker background. That's what I am, a Quaker. And that ties in with the pacifism, peace, and forgiveness as well. But see, well, it goes back to Canada, and it was actually a Mennonite. It was one Mennonite and one other probation officer, and that's the history of the part that is the victim offender conferencing. And what the two of them, probation officers, decided, they had offenders there. That's probably on another slide, but we'll come here. Let's see. Well, we'll just go there. To have them try to undo the damage, restore what they had taken away. It was vandalism. They had vandalized 22 houses in this small town, Elmira, Ontario. And the probation officer said, well, let's have them go to each person who they victimized in this manner and undo the damage and work with the person in the home to, say, paint the part they put graffiti or something, on the walls. And they got to be friendly and even friends with some of the people they had victimized. They turned their lives around, and that was a beautiful thing. It was publicized just enough so in Indiana, and I believe it was the Mennonites around the area of Goshen. I know Goshen's a Mennonite college there. And around that area, they got very active in restorative justice. And then from there, the book came out that was the kind of the foundational book in the field by Howard Zare called Changing Lenses. And in there, he writes about the adversary system, and then he writes about restorative justice. He traces it through the religious groups, and he talks about some of these. I couldn't believe I left out in this day and age. Islam, I thought, oh no, I forgot to put in Islam. Karen Armstrong, if you know her, she's written a lot of books on religion. And she says in all the major religions, and in the one she calls the God religions, that includes Islam, there was a focus on empathy, having empathy for the other person, the person who's a member of a different tribe or a different nationality. Welcoming, you see that in the Jewish religion in the Old Testament, welcoming strangers. You see other things when you read these old books, like if you read the Old Testament, you see a whole lot of revenge and a lot of things that we don't believe in today, stoning a woman who commits adultery, stoning her to death, and these things are in some of these old books as well. But restorative justice draws on the more modern concepts and the humanistic side. Christianity, as you know, forgiveness is a theme all the way through. And with the Mennonites, it was the Christian theme of forgiveness that was coming to the fore. But it doesn't mean you have to forgive the person who murdered someone in your family. Forgiveness is in the sense of letting go, not wanting revenge on the person, and sometimes actually to the point of forgiving the person, in the real Christian sense of that. I want to come to social work values because unique to social work is the activist portion of it compared to counseling and psychology and other fields that are in the helping professions. Because social work really requires service, and service in the, to the extent of advocacy for social justice. And social justice is one of the primary values. How many of you are familiar with the NASW Code of Ethics? Raise your hand if you... Okay, well, I know Joyous is and her students, and the rest of you can benefit from reading that as well. At the beginning, the values are set out. And that's a part, to me, that's very interesting. Now, human rights is not there. I keep writing to NASW saying, when are you going to include human rights in your code of ethics? They will, believe me. It won't be because of me, but it doesn't hurt to, and you all do that too, write in and say, this is omitted from the code of ethics. We've got to get human rights in there. There's a book that is published. He left, I guess he's not in social work or not interested, but at any rate, there's a book published by NASW, Social Work Speaks. It gives you policy. It gives you all the policies and the statements of the profession of social work. And there's a whole section on human rights. I haven't been able to get restorative justice in that book yet, but human rights is in there. I have gotten it in the dictionary. It's in the dictionary of social work. I wrote, years ago, I wrote to the editor there, and I said, you're missing restorative justice. Well, he had never heard of it. He said nobody would know that, and he wouldn't put it in. But he put me on the editorial board. I thought that was a real compliment, and then I opened the dictionary, and there are about 100 names there. So there are 100 of us on his editorial board. But it gave me the privilege of writing to him, and he wrote to me. I had harm reduction, and he finally put that in there. I would find these terms that were missing, and I'd write to him. And then he wrote later, and he said, yes, restorative justice belongs in there. So now we've got it defined. It's in the dictionary. I got it in the encyclopedia. I wrote to them and said I would like to write or have somebody write about harm reduction and restorative justice because they're not in the encyclopedia of social work. And they said you have to take a choice. You can only do one or the other. So I said, well, I'll do restorative justice, and then I got a co-author of my addictions book to do the other one, and she did harm reduction, and we got those in there. So that's how you can advocate in ways to get American social work to be aware. Today, I would say the field is aware. If you look on social work abstracts, there are now something like 24 references. When I looked 10 years ago, there were only 4, and 2 were mine. And these are where you look for the citations, you look into the abstracts and they'll give you a bibliography. And now they're up to 24. Mostly it's international material, but there are 2 books out, 2 other books other than our book, and they're both written from the social work standpoint. And one is Mark Umbright. He's been in the field for a long time at University of Minnesota, and he has a whole institute there for peace and restorative justice. And so students can go into the MSW program and they can study restorative justice through him, and he's come out with a marvelous book. None of these books are bestsellers. I can tell because I go on Amazon, and you can tell if a book's a bestseller by the number. The lower the number, the more best-selling the book is, and all of our books don't have low numbers. But still, it's a step forward. Well, we have dignity and worth of the person. This is a theme through restorative justice, to treat the wrongdoer and also the victim with respect. Now, I have to think of the adversary system. How many of you have been in a courtroom, whether listening, jury duty? Gosh, there must have been part of your classroom observation. It's, all these hands are up, you know. That is, if you were at a trial, how many was it a trial? Raise your hand. Okay, you have seen one side paints a picture one way, it's black and white, right? And the prosecutor gets up there, this is the most horrible offense, you know, practically happened in the whole state here or the county, and this person is, you know, worthless. And then the other side tells you that, oh, this person didn't even mean to do this. This person was drunk or something, didn't know what he or she was doing. And you hear a whole different portrait on the other side. It is thought the truth will come in the middle, and the people, if you have a jury, they will decide by listening to both sides which is right. Often they get so confused. They don't know what to think. And the defense says that's good. Get them so confused that they will go for a not guilty verdict. So a whole lot of people get let off. They will say they were found innocent. That's not true. They weren't found innocent. Like O.J. Simpson was not found innocent. It was found that there wasn't, the jury did not think there was a high enough level of proof to convict him at that trial. That's what it was. So you get this system, and the people who are on the jury are often kept from information that the judge has. And this is information about a prior criminal record of the person. Often that can't be brought out at trial. But if the individual takes the stand, it might come out through cross-examination. And so they'll tell you at the beginning of the trial, now you're going to hear from the defendant, himself or herself. Then at the end of the trial they say, well, you're not going to hear from the defendant. They twist it like that. That happened to O.J. Simpson. It happens over and over. It's a strategy. There are all these strategies. My sister was a public defender, and I watched her. I learned from her all these strategies. She was good at it. And so truth, and I've got the one, competence and integrity does not often come out. I've been at trials where there was perjury. I knew there was perjury. People up there just telling some kind of a wild story, usually on the side of the defense, right? And then the victim, I saw trials where the victim was a rape victim. My sister was cross-examining her, making out that she had dreamed it all up, that she was a chronic liar and everything else. Later, my sister decided she wouldn't take any more rape cases because she won every single one for the defendant by attacking the victim. So it can be a horrible ordeal. It can lead into trauma. It can re-traumatize the victim, what they have to go through. Now they're getting their mental health records and they're bringing that out. Oh, is it true you have bipolar personality? We got these records, which they can get. They can't go into her sex life, but they can go into other aspects of her or him, his life. So human rights is a part of this too, because, and that's when you get into reparative justice, repairing the damage for a whole community where a wrong has been committed against them. And one case, which we'll get to, is the Japanese Americans. They were given reparations because in World War II they were locked in concentration camps, their property was taken away. They were given a monetary reparations for each individual who had been harmed and for family members. I understand they didn't have the process, though. They didn't have the whole process of truth and reconciliation, but they at least got a judgment, and they felt there was some kind of reconciliation. And there was an apology by the government under Ronald Reagan, and to each individual person who had been wronged in that manner. We'll talk about that later, but that's the one that fits into human rights because this is where there are human rights violations. Social justice is a more general term. It's criticized because it's so general. It includes the advocacy. It has to do with fairness of people, treating them fairly, a lot of times economically in the system, equalizing the wealth in society. Importance of relationship, that's what restorative justice is all about. Now it says up there trauma-informed. Let me see what I have on that. Well, I'll tell you about that. It's in there later. But trauma, how many of you have heard of this? Trauma-informed care? All right, okay. This is the theme of our MSW program at UNI, is trauma-informed care. It had been empowerment. I didn't want to lose empowerment, but I don't have a whole lot of clout in the department. They took it out, and everything is trauma-informed practice and this and that. So I got into reading and learning about trauma-informed. And Bloom is the name of the person who came out with a book, not from social work. It's only recently come into social work. But it's working with people often in the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. These offenders have been so traumatized in their backgrounds. There's been child abuse in their backgrounds. And so the first rule here is to understand how trauma affects people. And I want to go tell you a story. So this is the story I want to tell you about. This will be the first one. It has to do with priest abuse. There are big cases now coming out of this area. And when, I got a phone call. It was about 2 weeks ago from a reporter from Harrisburg, from that area. And she told me that there were 8 priests who were being accused of sexual abuse of men and women, and that the victims were going to, or maybe they have testified before the grand jury. And she wanted to talk to me about a case because she couldn't figure out the dynamics of this woman and the behavior of this woman. And she was an investigative reporter, and she had time, she said, to really work on the case. And she just was trying to understand the traumatic part of it. Thank you. Yeah. And what the story was this priest was very close to this strict Catholic family. He was an important priest. And he had even a connection with the Pope and took the family to meet the Pope. So they went to the Vatican. I mean, that's how high up this priest was. And he was like a family member. Of course, they called him Father, which kind of brings incest into it in a way, you know, the fact that he was a father figure within this family. He started molesting her when she was 12 years old. She didn't tell anybody. And what she did was, in her mind, she split. This is her words, that she split her personality. And it was like part of her was being sexually abused or involved sexually with him, and the other part didn't even recognize that happened. That is a very good defense. Actually, that helps people to have some kind of defense mechanism, as Freud would say, that you can draw on, and that's how she survived childhood, and she didn't tell anybody. He didn't have full sexual relations with her until she was somewhat older, but it was some form of molesting her, touching her, and lying beside her, and all kinds of inappropriate things. Well, the part that is hard to understand, this went on until she was 32 years old. Yeah, 32. By then she was a married woman and she had children, and she was still, and this figure would come, this father figure would come over to the house, and then he would have sexual relations with her. One time the husband even sounded like he was pushing him away, you get your hands off my wife, and still he kept coming as a family member. Well, what it says to me is she was traumatized, and I call this a traumatic bonding. We used to call that the Stockholm Syndrome. I imagine she had strong feelings for the man. She didn't say that, and often these victims don't say that, but she must have been totally torn in her mind, especially the part of her personality that was having sex with him and continuing and not telling anybody and not telling the husband the whole story. So now she wants to come forward. Unfortunately, the priest has died. So she cannot, but she did have a confrontation with him on the telephone. She just called him up and was screaming at him when she sort of came to in her head. And she said, "This is what you've done to me since I was age 12. And he denied it, even to her. Usually they'll admit to the victim and, then you get it recorded and take it to court. But he just, maybe his mind was split as well, because he, like he had no awareness of this. Then when he died, she went to the funeral. She was seething with anger. And she had written a letter to him, and when nobody was looking, she slipped it under the coffin to go with him, wherever he was going. Isn't that amazing that she did that? And that was like her closure, and she felt a lot better after that. Something she did for herself. She wrote him a letter and told, anyway, so this is what the story the reporter was telling me, and the reporter said, well, the community would be very critical of her, because they'll say, well, you mean you carried on with this man and you were a married woman until you were 32 years old? Isn't that true? I mean, could you imagine that in a court of law, and she's on the stand and cross-examination? You mean to tell us that, you were so injured that you continued until you were age 32. See, they would just knock her down. They make her look like a fool. That is the goal of the cross-examination, is to demolish the witness. That's what I used to read these books on cross-examination and all the tricks, and confuse the jury and attack the witness and make the witness look like a fool. So it would not go well for her in the adversary system. Another problem is there's the Statute of Limitations. She's passed the year where in Pennsylvania she's allowed to even bring it to trial. The reporter said something like they're working on the law, trying to change the law, as they have in some states for these situations. But if you go through a restorative justice, you don't have to worry about the time lapse. And the church will answer to the individual. This is very important, because part of the trauma is loss. It's a great loss, right? Loss of self-confidence, loss of faith in yourself, but also loss of religious faith. And you see that with the young men who were molested in situations of priest abuse, and you see it even more with the young women, because we did some studies, we did some research on these women through a student I had who was doing her thesis, and then we published that as an article. That's why the reporter called me, because of that article that we did on priest abuse, and then I referred her to the woman herself who had been victimized, so she can interview her. But do you see the beauty of restorative justice here? The Catholic Church, if you're going into a court of law, they are opposed to the victim. They are denying it ever happened. And they're attacking the person. And they're accusing the person of attacking the Catholic Church and of causing them harm and losing money and all this. And family members also a lot of times attack these victims when they come out. They say, Father so-and-so never would have done such a thing. What's wrong with you? Where did you get this idea from? And they might say, well, I was in therapy talking to my therapist. They say, well, that's where it came from. It didn't actually happen. It's just a false memory. Well, with restorative justice, they listen to the person. They listen, to the suffering. And the ideal way would be you would have the offender, the priest would be there too. And see, you don't do this with somebody who we used to call a psychopath, somebody who had no conscience. You don't do that. Restorative justice is for people who feel bad about what they've done. They feel remorse, and they're going to take responsibility. And I'm thinking that priests have some good in them, right? They say there's good in everybody, but some people there's not much good in them. But I think to go into the priesthood, they probably have a conscience, and they probably would be good for this, to wake up to what they've done and the harm they've done, and to apologize for it, and to turn their lives around. This case, he's died, but the Catholic Church is bearing responsibility because of the cover-up. And there was only one case in America I could find. It was in Rhode Island, and they said it was a beautiful event. The Catholic Church came, apologized. They awarded the victim or victims with money, a substantial sum of money for that suffering. And see, this is good for their religious faith, too, and keeps them in the Catholic Church or some other church, so that they don't lose that. They're not fighting. It's not adversarial. So that would be the case. So anyway, I'm talking to this woman, and I said, and we're talking about priest abuse and with a focus on trauma and traumatic bonding. And what happened to some kidnapped victims? They didn't run away. J.C. Dugard is a case. Emily Smart is another case. And they had a boy, I can't think of his name, it starts with Horn, H-O-R-N. And he was a case. He was 11 years old, kidnapped, sexually abused for years. He even went to the police station to say his bike was stolen. And he didn't even say that he was living with the kidnapped victim. He had been taken away from his family. See, they bond with the kidnapper in some cases, not all cases, of kidnapping. And then they don't go out to a court of justice. They don't go to the police station and turn them in. And all these cases, they were rescued by somebody who recognized them from their photograph. Or it came out because of another kidnapping, and then they find the older victim there. Oh, what are you doing here? Well, golly, this is the little boy who was taken away years ago. Well, that is traumatic bonding. You explain it's a psychological phenomenon that has to do with survival. To survive, they bond to some extent with the person who is powerful over them, holds everything over them. When they go to the bathroom, food, everything. They don't go to school. They don't usually, when they're young, they don't leave the house. J.C. Dugard then was given access to the front house. She was said to be the sister of the children who she bore. She was their mother, but they were told she was their big sister, and that they were the parents, the two kidnappers. She doesn't say she bonded with them. I mean, now she says she hated them, but you have to explain why she stayed there all those years. And she was dealing with the public as part of her job that the man had for her. And it was a policewoman who caught on, met the children and said, these children are not normal children. One was about 14 and one was 11. And she just started investigating. She thought the children were maybe kidnapped victims, and then found out the man was on parole as a sexual offender, and actually those were his biological children. And he was not allowed to even be around children. And then J.C. Dugard gave a false name and pretended that she was the sister until they exposed her. Today she's doing really well. In fact, all these former victims are doing well psychologically. I went back, to find out the research, and I've seen her, Diane Sawyer, on TV. She's done marvelously well. But there's been trauma to her, and her mother is not doing as well as she is, in my opinion. When they interview the mother, she's crying and upset, and she's feeling guilty because she didn't kiss her goodbye the last time she saw her before she was kidnapped. Anyway, that's how trauma fits in here. and trauma-informed, is to understand trauma and the nature of trauma. But when I was talking to the woman on the phone, the reporter, I said, you know, I'm flying into Harrisburg. I said, in a week, I'm going there to speak on restorative justice. Well, I guess she was like, well, what is restorative justice? And I said, well, you know, it would fit in beautifully with this case. And so I started telling her about, that's the process that this woman needs. And then I sent her information. There's a chapter in the book on priest abuse and restorative justice, written by a man in Europe who has been involved. It's widely used there in Ireland and other countries, in Germany, where they've had priest abuse cases. They've used the restorative justice with reparations, giving them a monetary settlement. These are the basic forms of restorative justice, and the ones I'll talk about are the victim offender conferencing, roots in Mennonite restitution, and then reparative justice, truth and reconciliation commissions. The one that's Native American, it's usually said to be a Native American development, and that's the circles. That's the process that has been borrowed and used a lot. Did you all use anything like that? The circles, did you have a feather too? Or something?
The talking piece, and we just
Talking piece, yeah.
Kate Fran is here for 3 days.
Oh, she's in the book too.
Yeah,
And the reason these giants in the field are in the book is because Lauren Walker knows all these people, because she has traveled the world and done workshops. And so she said she could get, when I wrote her the email, she said she could get Pranis and these others to write in the book. I said, you can? Wow, that's fabulous. Then I had my contacts from Hong Kong and other, usually Asian countries. I had some contacts, but they weren't famous. They might be famous in their own realm, but not in America. You know, she got Howard Zare and others to do some writing for us. Well, I'll see if there's anything I didn't say about the adversary system. It's Anglo-Saxon, and I've always said, well, I criticize it in other books, but I can't really come up with a better system. But restorative justice is a better system, but not for every case. But it works for a lot of cases, a lot of situations, especially where you want people to change. You think people are redeemable, and you want them to turn their lives around. On the offender side, and the victim really wants to have the support of the community and get that support and recognition for the suffering. So I think I said all these things. And then, of course, usually we have plea bargaining, and they don't even go to court. Most cases don't go to court. They work with the prosecutor. And usually somebody for a drug offense will turn in somebody else to get the sentence shortened with the mandatory sentencing, because these sentences are really long. There are women in prison because the men in their lives have turned them in for making a phone call or just helping them in the business or taking drugs with them, like becoming a meth addict along with the man, and then he turns her in. And in some cases, the women have gotten longer sentences for conspiracy than the men have, because they'll say, well, he cooperated with the prosecutor and she did not. Well, who's she going to turn in? She probably doesn't know anybody, and she's not going to turn in her son if he was involved, and she can't turn in the husband because he's already been caught. Some of the presidents have given them pardons. I think Bill Clinton did, and Obama's been giving pardons to people, or at least reducing their sentences also. So some of these people have been released. They made a wonderful movie about one of them who was charged with conspiracy crime. She hadn't done anything but pick up the telephone one time, and she was serving a long sentence for that. So that's what happens with working with the prosecution. And also, the focus is on the offender, not the victim, is another thing, whereas this process, the focus is on the wrongdoing that was done and the victim. But there's also focus, especially in the First Nations people, they've had circles, healing circles that they have, and they will go into the cultural backgrounds involving trauma in the past of, say, the person who's the offender. And some of that was that they were sent, one man had been sent to a boarding school to wipe out his culture, and that was a traumatic experience for him that was brought out in that case. Yeah, here are the paradoxes. I just worked this out because I thought, hey, you know, there's so many contradictions here. The first one is that it often operates through the criminal justice system, even though it's an alternative form of justice. And then it's very practical, and you notice the subtitle of our book is Practical Applications, and it shows how to do it. And the reentry and all of this is described in detail by Lauren Walker. She wrote those chapters, showing you actually how it is done. And yet it's visionary, it's idealistic. Some people think it's unrealistic, but it's not. And the evidence-based studies that are being done, to gather the evidence, it shows it's reduced recidivism in the prison system. People are less likely to reoffend. But for the families, it's very, very helpful for them. And they're almost always positive. And if you ask them if they have testified in a court of law, they're almost always negative about some of the things that have taken place. And the suffering caused to them through the cross-examination. They say, I was just absolutely humiliated, you know. My mother was sitting there, and then they brought out all this stuff and made me look really bad. And, you know, here this person is a witness or a victim of a crime. They knock down the witnesses, too. They say, well, you couldn't have seen what you saw. And then they try to show they're intellectually impaired or something going on with them. It's a new approach, but it also goes back to ancient customs. And they say in every indigenous population in the world, this would be Aborigines in Australia, all these indigenous populations, the Maori definitely in New Zealand, they have had what we would call restorative justice, where the victim comes there and meets with the offender and they get together and the community surrounds them and talks to them. So a whole lot of personal interaction going on. In our courts of law, in the traditional approach, you're not allowed, you know, what if you say, I want to call up the man who committed this crime in our family? They'll say, no, 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 right? And often they'll sit on one side of the courtroom, and then the people who are the family members of the offender, they sit on the other side, and they make dirty looks to each other, right? And sometimes they call out things, and it gets to be very much about hostility and negativism. Yeah, this approach is person-centered as a way of dealing with crime, but yet we have been in an age where it's locked people up and don't relate to the personal aspect of the person who's the wrongdoer or the offender. This is changing today because rehabilitation is coming back into the criminal justice system, and that opens the door for restorative justice as well. It's victim oriented, and yet it's very beneficial to the offender. It's secular, yet it's religious in its overtone, and sometimes there's a prayer, especially in Canada, in the Canadian system. It might start out with a prayer or some kind of a ceremony. Did you all have something at the beginning? Meditation or something like that? And the roots, being Mennonite, go to Christianity for the victim-offender conferencing. I want to say a word about the terminology. It's called mediation a lot, and it's not mediation. And I've sent out emails to people who are like Mark Umbright, who used the term mediation. And I tell him, I don't know if he appreciated it because he didn't write me back. Later I got to meet him, and he's a very fine person. And he's come out with a film called Forgiveness that you can get right on YouTube called Forgiveness of Mark Albright interviewing the people. But I said mediation is not the term. Do any of you want to pick up that argument and say why mediation would not be the term to use here? It should be conferencing, dialoguing, or something else? Well, because what is mediation? You know, you think of a divorce, don't you? And you could go to a lawyer and you could have mediation. You could have a process. There's some lawyers who specialize in that. And it means you're going to give up something, the other person's going to give up something. You take the dog and they take the cat, right? Rather than have a big fight over it. And one person gets the house, and the house come with the kids come with the house often. And then the other person, you know, maybe gets some kind of payment, or I don't know. But they work it all out. That person maybe gets the stock, all the stocks they had. They had some kind of income there. Then that person gets something, and one person gets the house. So you mediate. Each side gives up something, and it's assumed the two people are equals. This case, they're not equals. One person has wronged the other, and you're not asking the victim to mediate anything. Do you see that? Where the term's wrong? If you look it up in the dictionary, you say, well, that's not the right term for this. I've never looked it up in the dictionary, but I know good and well what mediation is, and this isn't mediation.
The goals are different. So mediation is to come to some sort of agreement, in my mind, that you can resolve a conflict or resolve an issue, and so there's a different sort of goal. The goal for conferencing or dialoguing is about sharing experience.
Mm-hmm.
You may not see eye to eye.
Yeah.
There may be forgiveness. But what it is it's an opportunity to share experience and
Yeah.
perspective and impact.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what mediation is. Mediation is to come to some
Yeah, and it doesn't matter about their relationship in mediation. It's just to come with this contract. It's a very legalistic. I mean, it could be, or it could be. Well, you might have mediation. I remember I wanted that on my faculty. I wanted to have some kind of mediation with somebody I was having a problem with. You know, where we would get together. Maybe that would have been more like restorative justice, but neither of us was a guilty party, see. You know, I just wanted to have some kind of mediation because he had quit speaking to me, and I thought, well, maybe he would start talking. We did make up beautifully, and now we're good friends, but it took 2 years of him not speaking to me. And I kept asking, you know, couldn't we have some mediation? Actually, they sent us to a formal mediator, but then he refused to talk. So it didn't do any good. But that's different. So I say that in the book, and when I met Mark Albright, I didn't have time to talk to him, but I had sent an email earlier, and I noticed the title of his book that came out later was Dialoguing. He didn't put mediation for the first time. It was, I think it's victim offender dialoguing. And so I thought, well, maybe I got through to him on that. But it's not just him, it's all over the world they're using the term mediation. And I guess you could redefine the term because I know what they really mean. And it's the same thing as what I mean, but they just picked the wrong term in the early days, and it caught on. I've even seen Howard Zare use the term mediation. I guess I should write him too. Okay, it's an indigenous approach, but it can be applied in the modern world. And then last, I have a beacon of light to shine in the darkness. I saw that as a paradox too. You've got darkness because you have some wrong, some crime that's been committed, and you're shining a light in that darkness. Here I talk about trauma, and I've already mentioned everything here. I think there's also, of course, the secondary trauma to the family. Families where there's been a crime that's taken place. And the post-traumatic stress disorder. It's been found that if you have treatment, therapy right away, and also there's medication that can be given to people who have been traumatized, like in a war zone, for example, and somebody's been exposed to an explosive or seen, you know, his friend blown up next to him, and he's likely to have been traumatized, they would give them a drug. And because the trauma really is biological. And studies have shown that children who are traumatized, their brains actually change. The good news is through therapy, they can change again. It has to do with levels of neurotransmitters, is what I can find out. This is really written out by pioneers in the field, and usually they're cognitive researchers and also neurologists, and they're talking about the brain. It doesn't mean, though, everybody who's exposed to trauma actually, has all the post-traumatic stress disorder. There are a lot of children who come from war zones, for example, Syria and earlier Bosnia, who've made really good adjustments despite they were exposed to trauma, but they're not suffering from the post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, there are people who are fighting in war and combat, and they come back and they make a healthy adjustment to life. But some people are more vulnerable than other people, right? They're more sensitive. We don't know why some of them would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and others would not. But Donald Trump says he has an explanation. Anybody hear that?
Yes.
Tell us.
He basically said, in other words, that people who have PTSD from the military are weak, and
Yeah.
that's why they have it.
Yeah.
If you're weak, you, I guess.
Yeah, he was looking down on them, wasn't he? Did you all hear that in the back? Weak. They're weak. I didn't get to hear the news report. I've been traveling, but I just saw the headline. I thought, well, that's, we need to work with him, right, and try to educate him. I'd email him, but he wouldn't get the email. And tell him about, well, I'd tell him a thing or two about some other things as well. And I'll find out if he's teachable, if he could really listen. But his kids say yes, don't they? They say he's a very good father and a very good listener, so we'll have to see. Even Hillary Clinton could use some work. And I did get phone calls in Iowa. Oh, there's so many ads in Iowa, you wouldn't believe it, these political ads. And you hear the voice, this is Hillary Clinton, and it's her voice, right on the phone calling me up. But then when you speak, it's a recording, and she's not really there. So trauma-informed care, yeah, that's what I mentioned. And you can get all kinds of information through the government, through SAMHSA. And that stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So through the addictions field, they're really looking into trauma, and in the correctional field, especially for women in the criminal justice system. And I could see restorative justice fitting in very well and helping people reduce the trauma. This is something that would be very therapeutic for them, for the offenders. Oh, here's the book I was telling you about. It's Sandra Bloom and Farringer, Destroying Sanctuary. Learned helplessness, that's a good term. Uh-huh.
And just for Pennsylvania, there's also the Keystone Crisis Intervention Team, which does a lot of trauma-informed training and crisis response. So.
Yeah, and that's really popular now. It's going around. Is this through any connection to social work and the trauma-informed presentations? Or through sociology, criminology? Where is it coming from? I mean,
Keystone Crisis Intervention Team actually comes out of Victim Services.
Okay.
But it's a statewide team. It's a statewide presence all around Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
All over the state.
Yeah, and that would really be good for the academic world, wouldn't it?
Right, and we do trainings. We have a number of trainings.
Okay, so you all hear that. You can probably get, usually it's not very expensive to go to those trainings, and we've had them too, and I've gotten to go to a number of them. And usually they'll have a speaker who's been just horribly traumatized through life, maybe gone through prostitution and all kinds of things, and had just terrible things happening to her and in the criminal justice system. And then today, who even went on, one of them studying for a PhD, and taking the word out about trauma and the nature of trauma, and to help save these children who've been brought up the way that she was brought up. Yeah, and there's that ACE, so you've heard of that, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. We did this, you fill it out, and well, you have a list of all these experiences you've been exposed to. And people in our faculty were coming out, we were competing, you know, who got a bigger score than somebody else. But that's something that they can use in research. They can get scores of people, and then they can relate it to something else, like substance abuse or something else that, you know, maybe correlates with having a high score on this ACE. But the learned helplessness is the same as traumatic bonding. And some battered women go through this, don't they? Because they've been isolated from all their loved ones. And they don't get the feedback anymore on the way they're being treated and on themselves. They lose their self-esteem. A lot of times they're told they can't work. They just have to stay home. Some of the foreign women are not allowed to learn English, and they're kept as sort of like captives in their own home, the man who's beating them up. And remember, it could be reversed. It could be the woman beating up the man. And I've known cases like that in the addiction field, where the man had the learned helplessness because of the power that the woman, the psychological power that she had over him.
10
Oh, are we going to take a 10?
minutes. No, it's 10, you have 10 minutes.
Oh, really? Well, I'm doing really well. Okay, well, thank you. Because I want to make sure I talk about the ones I was going to talk about. Let me find it. I want to talk about re-entry. They had to leave early, they told me. Re-entry in Hawaii. This is the program. It's predominantly Hawaiian women. They have substance abuse problems. Their culture has been destroyed by, sort of with missionaries and sailors who went into Hawaii, and the native people really got overwhelmed by all the newcomers coming in, and they lost a lot of positives from their culture. So you can call that the historical trauma. Same with Native Americans, people in Appalachia, and that's part of the problem there with the opioid prescription drug abuse that's going on in Appalachia. You could trace it back to exploitation in Appalachia of the people there, and also their own individual abuse growing up. So this term, I don't know how to pronounce it, hui kahi, and the hui part of it means group and the kahi means individual. So they name it that for their restorative justice, because you have the group and the individual together here. And what they do is, it's voluntary by the inmates, and about a third of them agree that they want this. They're about to be released on parole, or maybe not parole, and they're coming into society, and they're going to be taking care of the kids again, maybe living in the home with the mother or father. And there's a lot of anger in the family, a lot of family dynamics that you might say are disturbed dynamics. And she wants to apologize for all the harm that she's caused them through maybe her substance abuse or whatever. And they bring them together and they have a circle there, a healing circle. This works really well, and then the studies show that the recidivism rate was reduced because of that. Okay, this is what I did research on. We come to financial exploitation of elders. I could talk a lot more than 10 minutes about this because this happened in my family. And we went through the adversary system, and it was a disaster. This happened to my mother, who is not living anymore. She had dementia. People were taking advantage of her like you wouldn't believe. She bragged about her rent houses, and then you'd hear them say, oh, give me one of your rent houses. But that was just the beginning. There were loggers taking all the logs and paying her, almost nothing for them and tricking her. She was trying to run a business. She said she would never retire, and she was around 90 years old. My sister and I were trying to stop her from doing these business dealings. And then my niece went and got $10,000 from her by telling her that she was going to go to jail if she didn't have the money. My mother's heart went out to her grandchild and said, well, I'll give you the money right now, wrote her a check. That became a big issue with actually my sister who is her mother. And so the family is very divided. We went to court to try to get the money back, and we lost, and she got to keep the money. And the adversary system did not work for us very well. You could see the different kinds of exploitation. They tell these people, these older people, they're going to paint their driveway, and they have a special paint that's going to take the cracks out. This happened among Quakers. And so they paid the people in advance, and then they painted the driveway black. And of course it didn't. They just put some old paint on there, took the money and ran. I mean, these are kind of situations you have. If you could have caught them, you could have had them prosecuted, but then you could have given them an alternative if they had any conscience at all about what they did. Often it's within the family, though. It's people getting them to sign over their property. And we had that. My mother was signing over property to people because they would request it, and they would just keep on until she would sign over something to them. And what I found out, I'll come to that, was we're going to Canada again to Ontario, and there's a restorative justice approaches there, and they give you a case history. And the case history sounded just like the case we had, except it was more money, $40,000. In this case, it was actually stolen. The son stole the money from his mother. The brothers and sisters were outraged. I'm sure they wanted to lock him up and send him off to prison. He loved his mother. He felt really bad about that. I can't remember, was it gambling or something like that, that he wanted that money for. And it's some form of addiction, probably. And so they worked it out. So he came and had a meeting, and then he was paying back his mother. And at the meeting, he told his mother, and the siblings could hear how much he loved her and how sorry he was that he had taken the money. And the mother, actually, she wasn't going to prosecute him. That's the thing. They're not going to prosecute a child in the family themselves. So this is about the only way you could get justice, right? And they're very happy to do this. They say, yes, I want to talk to him. I want to tell him what he took away from me and from the family and his brothers and sisters. I want to let him know how heartbroken I was that a child of mine would do this to me, because I thought, he didn't love me, or he wouldn't have taken the money, and the way I brought him up, the values, and, she wanted to express all that. So it worked out beautifully in the case history that they give you, and you could use this in cases, I think, locally. It would be the only thing that would work in a whole lot of cases to bring people together. I'll see if I have anything there I didn't say. Yeah, the police in Canada were referring cases that they couldn't handle. They were too difficult for them to handle, and they referred it to this team. So you just look up online, Restorative Justice Approaches to Elder Abuse Project, and see if we could get that in Pennsylvania. 5 minutes left, and I probably don't have anything. Oh gosh, I didn't talk about. Oh gosh, thank you. Truth and Reconciliation, the most outstanding commission that ever took place was in South Africa. It actually gave them a whole new country. It gave them a democracy, because they were willing to declare amnesty for the white people who had been involved in the apartheid system, and they had abused and mistreated the black people and what they called the colored people, mixed race people, and they had to face their accuser, and they had to apologize, or they would have been prosecuted. And I want to turn that into the main narratives. Let's see. This is what I would like to see. There's some arguments. Black Lives Matter. I looked online, Black Lives Matter, and typed in reparations, because I know that they asked Bernie Sanders about if he believed in reparations for slavery. He was kind of confused and just said no, no, no. But it is coming up in Congress. There's a bill every year coming up just to look into the possibility of reparations. It never gets off the floor, but it might now, thanks to Black Lives Matter, and they had it all worked out. And I loved, I don't know how to pronounce his name, let me know if you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I read that he's a real celebrity, that he's very well known, and he wrote this article, Reparations, but he was asking for slavery reparations, and he said 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal. And I have the book going around, The Made Narratives. I'll be talking about that tomorrow in another class. But when you read those stories, you would say, these women, they worked in the cotton fields, they got almost nothing, their families got nothing. They started off with only the suitcase, if they even had a suitcase. These were women of the Great Migration. I know they're in Pennsylvania too. They moved up to Waterloo, Iowa, and these were the women we interviewed, and we got their stories. They were full of forgiveness. Speaking of forgiveness, they were very religious women. They're church-going. They sing in the choir. They're older women. We wanted the stories from before 1964. And I'm a Southerner, you know. I got the white stories. I got people in my own family. And I interviewed my sister, my aunt. Somebody criticized the book and said, it's just her own family. And social workers. And they said, who could believe, one critic said, who could believe the social workers because, you know, they're liberal. I put it on the listserv. I wanted to get these narratives, and I got tremendous response after the movie The Help, which I don't like, but it came out. And people wanted to tell the stories of growing up with a maid in the family from my hometown of New Orleans. And so we had social work stories, and then we had my aunt and my mother and people I knew telling their stories. And if you read those stories, I don't argue for reparations because I didn't think of it when we were doing this a few years ago, but it would certainly apply to them. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.